All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us. My name's E.R. Anderson. I am the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is a nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. And I am here tonight for a special pre publication event with Jude Ellison S. Doyle. He is the author of D.I.L.F. Did I Leave Feminism? Definitely the best title of the year, if I do say so myself. I'm really excited to be having this conversation with him. You may know him as the author of Trainwreck, The Women We Love to Hate, Mock, and Fear, and Why, and Dead Blondes and Bad Mothers, Monstrosity, Patriarchy, and the Fear of Female Power. He is also the author of the graphic novels Ma SC and The Neighbors. His work has appeared in These Times, The Guardian, Elle.com, The Atlantic, Slate, BuzzFeed, Rookie, among other publications. He is also the founder of the blog Tiger Beatdown, and he currently lives in upstate New York. So welcome, Jude. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
So I want to let folks know that you can drop your questions in the chat at any time, and then we'll kind of work them into the conversation. But Jude, the main when I first saw this, obviously the title made me laugh, and but the reason that I was drawn to it is that you and I have some similar experiences as trans men who had long public feminist histories. So I have worked very publicly and led a feminist nonprofit and worked in a feminist bookstore my entire life, and then transitioned at the ripe old age of 32. And you had a very popular feminist blog, Tiger Beatdown, and also wrote two books, feminist books, under your previous name. And so I wonder maybe if we could start there. What was it like for you to experience one kind of public feminist identity or fame and transition into this new chapter of your public life as a writer and intellectual?
Yeah, it was absolutely very bizarre. I mean, I kind of stumbled sideways into being public. It was a very weird moment on the internet where if you just showed up and had really strongly held opinions on the internet, someone would decide you were an expert. So I had, a really like within 6 months of Tiger Beatdown starting, I was like getting a lot of traffic and I didn't have a lot of time to adapt to the idea that I had become a public person or that I was, sort of public under the wrong gender. So it was a, it's a strange and weird experience. And I think I wasted a lot of lessons. But when I came out and transitioned, it felt like I knew I was getting better. I suddenly had a stronger grasp of bodily autonomy than I ever have had. I had to think about things in a more complex, more nuanced way. I had, I thought, a pretty useful perspective based on having been seen as, two different genders. But a lot of what I received was like this confusion of like, well, were you lying before or are you lying now? Or did you just give up on your ideals? Are you like getting out while you can and leaving the ship of womanhood to sink behind you? And I knew that a lot of trans guys had either gotten those questions or just sort of tortured themselves with them. I tortured myself with them a lot. Um, and it just felt like a good sticky place to just, if you're going to write a book, you're going to be alone with it for a year. And I really strongly needed to be alone with those questions for a year and not have to like post about them on Twitter.
Yeah.
So it felt like, yeah, I'm just going to lean into the most uncomfortable thing possible for me at this time.
Yeah, I think that question of were you a liar then or are you a liar now is so painful.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that people that really surprised me about myself and that I often try and articulate to others is like I have to be so much more grounded in my feminism and in my anti-racism and everything, all of the things that I always got credit for believing back in the day when I looked like a butch dyke. People just assumed that I was much more with it than I probably was, because of how I looked. And now that I walk down the street, I could be a white supremacist, based on how I look, right? People are like, I don't know about that guy. Um, it's very, all I have are my actions, right? It's
Yeah.
like my words aren't even enough. Like, all I have are the habitual ways that I show up for people in my community. And I think that I kind of wish that everybody had that experience. I mean, everybody should and can have that experience, right? But really, feminism, so much of the critiques we see of white feminism are like, well, what skin do you have in the game? And one of the things that I see in this book is a intersectional approach to that question, and I would argue that it is informed by your transness, right? That
Yeah.
actually, by becoming a white man, it's a lot easier to understand the racial politics of white womanhood and
Mhm.
of the United States investment in white womanhood, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And that lends a different perspective. And so I wonder, first of all, this book is great in terms of just being an excellent primer on feminisms in general. So I hope people, like, I would give this to a high school student, a smart high school student, but a high school student. And certainly I would teach this in college courses because I think it's just so accessible around a lot of different um,
Yeah.
feminist issues that are very topical. So could we talk about kind of how you structured the book and how you thought about, okay, well, where do I begin?
Yeah, I absolutely knew that I didn't want to, and you don't have to at this juncture in history, write a book on what being trans is. But I also knew that in order to even start, I started to sit down. I was like, "Well," and I was like, oh, I'm now 5,000 words into an attempt to define what gender is and the different things we mean when we say those terms. Um, I sort of come from a family of teachers. A ton of my family are public school teachers. And what I felt was, because this was a book about being located between places, about being in transition, and about having two identities that are perceived to be in conflict with each other, even though I don't personally feel that they are. Um, what was most important to do was to break down everything as clearly as possible and always be aware of the moments where I was potentially translating from one group to another. So an example is that, like, Andrea Dworkin's discussed in the book, and she's discussed both positively and in terms of like some horrendous, negative, harmful things she did. And when I first put the book in, my editor, who, as far as I know, is a cis woman, was like, well, all of her books are out of print. She's been widely vilified. People hate her. Like, why go in on her? She's dead. She can't do anything. And I was like, okay, so good. This is a translation moment, because if I say Andrea Dworkin, I can name 5 trans people who are going to conclude that I hate them and that I want them eliminated from the face of the planet. So this is a really good moment to like jump in and explain what the divides were, and like eventually you have to explain what the sex wars were and all of that. Hopefully it's not too condescending. Like you say, I think people who pick up this book are already going to be pretty bright, but you never know when you're talking to two groups of people who have a really fractious history. What's going to be common basic knowledge to one group is not going to be common basic knowledge to the other, you know?
Yeah, Andrea Dworkin's books have just been reprinted.
Yeah.
And there's actually been a real resurgence. Charis is located right next to a historic women's college, Agnes Scott, and there's been a real resurgence in interest in a kind of gender essentialist feminism that isn't anti-trans, that doesn't perceive itself to be anti-trans.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think you make the point that maybe we should talk about man hating. You talk about man hating, your history as a man hater, uh, and the good reasons why some people hate men, right? But also certainly hate individual men. Um, but also why a sort of gender essentialist man hating is harmful, and limiting, and also sort of like what do we need to do, particularly for younger feminists, around creating a feminism that's more expansive than that, while still acknowledging the ways in which patriarchy is causing deep violence and pain and fear among
Yeah. Yeah.
feminists today.
And that's the thing, is that I think that where you get, how do you get from, Dworkin being very much against the idea that like biological sex and biological gender was even a thing, or Shulamith Firestone, for instance, being just like vehemently against biology as inherently worthwhile or inherently serious, something that we should allow to limit our behavior, to this really biologically essentialist sort of common present day turf thing where it's just like men are inherently predators and women are inherently fragile and you need a good man to defend you from all the bad men. Like that argument is based in a Victorian concept of gender that has never been part of any feminist movement that I'm aware of. We've just brought it back. And it's deeply embedded in whiteness because, of course, like the fragile, delicate, virtuous women are always white. And the dangerous, scary, threatening men are very often black or brown in that equation. But to me, I think that when you decouple the idea of man as a person who experiences power in the patriarchy, and this is what radical feminism is good for. Yeah, this is where you start to think about gender not just as an identity or as a way of making yourself seen in the world, but as a system of power relations. When we say that, the Platonic ideal of a man in patriarchy is someone who is on top, someone who exercises coercive, dominant power over gender marginalized people, then it is kind of natural to hate men or at least fear men. It's always natural to fear anyone who's over and above you. And I think a lot of men hate men for that reason. I think a lot of men are very aware of where they stand in the hierarchy and have a lot of resentment and anger for the guys they see as like alphas or on top of the game, even as they might, like log into Andrew Tate's YouTube channel or whatever and aspire to become them. They also hate those guys. But if we say that that's all a man is or all a man can ever be, not only are we negating or ignoring all of the many cultural constructs or cultural contexts rather that are not white Western cis heteropatriarchy. I'm sorry, I'm like really piling on the syllables here. But we also take away the possibility for change. We take away the possibility that man can mean more and woman can mean more, and all of us can be more than our set roles in this biologically determined hierarchy could ever allow for, right? So I think that like I absolutely do relate to having like very deep anger at men. And it's easy to say hate, when you look at the world and you see people who are out to exploit you or harm you or do you harm. I experienced a lot of violence, and men were very often the people dealing it out. Not always, but most of the time. Nobody's telling you that you have to like those guys. What they are asking you to do, or what I'm asking you to do, is consider that they didn't do it because they were men. They did it because they were addicted to a system of power and an ideal of masculinity that would reward them for doing that to you. And that the really horrific, nightmarish thing about that violence is not that they were like biologically hardwired to do it. No one has a gene that makes them be shitty to service workers. No one has ever like groped a waitress's ass in a cafe because evolution made them do it. They did that because they chose to do it, because they enjoyed the power that it gave them in that moment. And as horrifying as it is to know that some people choose that, that also means that there's a possibility to choose otherwise and to do better.
Yeah, and I mean, I think when you break it down as a system of power relationships, I mean, it is very similar to whiteness and white supremacy, right? And people can begin to see those relationships that like there are people with white skin, and then there are people who act white, capital W, right? And like you don't have to act white if you are a white person, meaning you don't have to be domineering, you don't have to take up so much space, you don't have to assume the world is built for you, right? You
Yeah.
can share what you have. You can seek reparations. You can do all these things, and I think the same is true for people who find themselves at the top of the gender hierarchy or who are perceived to, right? And I think one of the things that you talk about being afraid of when you realized that you were a man and needed to come out, and that many trans men experience, is, oh shit, like I'm gonna be the enemy,
Mm.
and this is, how can I do that? Like how you know I've lived my whole life afraid of men, or angry at men, or sometimes jealous of men, but like
Yeah.
unable to reconcile my relationships with men in a way that are happy, healthy, whole. And now I have to recognize that I am one, and then also tell the people in my life, especially the women in my life, that that's what I understand about myself, which can feel like a betrayal, or the fear is that it will be a betrayal.
Yeah. And I mean, it feels weird. It feels like you're introducing distance between yourself and the people you care about. And I think, especially early in transition, I was so hyper conscious of it. I was like, I will disavow my male privilege at every turn. And it's, well, you need to calm down, because like 98% of grocery store clerks still call you ma'am. Like, it's not clear how much male privilege you're experiencing 3 weeks on T, but like, it's good that you're ready to go for when that kicks in. Um, but just it it is something that I think inspires a lot of guilt and a lot of fear and a lot of shame, that you might have to turn around and tell the people in your life. I felt it with my mom. I felt really sad that like she thought we had a bond based on our gender and that I was going to refute that, but she's also still my mom. Like, she knows me. She doesn't really. I've always been a really weird kid. I don't think she enjoyed having that much in common with me. But it you have to get past the idea that manhood is some universally shared mystical essence that makes us all behave the same way and think the same way and do the same things. You're always going to be constructed out of your experiences. You're always going to be informed by them. And that means the experiences you have after coming out and after transitioning. I do find myself sometimes when I'm like in an argument with a woman, I realize that I could be a lot more intense about this when I look like I used to look. Because now that intensity is going to come across as like scary, and I need to back the fuck up and be a little bit, leave her some space so that I'm not being a scary dude in her face. But that's an experience that, informs who I am. Uh, and not to lose my train of thought entirely, if you didn't feel like you were terrifically aligned with patriarchy, and if you cared about feminism, and if you cared about, the rights of marginalized people more generally before transition, then you do need to get past the idea that testosterone, or the horrific power of male socialization, is just gonna like come in and brainwash you in the middle of the night, and you're gonna wake up with like Maxim mags in your hand, and like Bill Maher is gonna be on the TV, and you'll be like, no, I've always lived like this is me, this is who I am. Like,
Yeah,
yeah,
you don't suddenly become a weird
right,
bro. Yeah, no, that's very true. But that, like, you talk about having arguments and stuff. I do think there are those moments where your body speaks for you, right?
mm,
And you don't realize that it's speaking for you. I mean, and, I think a lot about, like, gender is in the eye of the beholder a lot of the time. Like, we can feel whatever we feel, but we navigate through the world, and people gender us and misgender us constantly. And sometimes even being gendered correctly feels
yeah,
bad, because like I remember the first time um my mom and I, who are very close, like, had a disagreement, and I raised my voice, not in a mean way, but now different. It's different coming from this embodiment than it was 10 years ago.
yeah.
and I look a lot more like my dad, who she divorced. So there's that, and it's like that. But then also, I spent a lot of time getting misgendered and not ever knowing whether or not I was being read as a man or read as a woman, and therefore not being sure which
Mm,
way to go, which bathroom to use, all of those things, right? And I think people who don't know very many trans people or don't like trans people assume that our entire life is this uh, deception, right? It's like we
yeah,
are willfully deceiving people, as opposed to what it really is a game of like, I'm trying to actively sort of look into all of these constantly shifting mirrors to
yeah,
see like, oh, am I being read in this way? Okay, then I'm going to respond in this way. Am I being read in this way? I'm going to respond in this way, while still holding on to self, which is challenging. Um, and you talk about Polly Murray. I don't know
yeah.
if you want to. I hope people know who Polly Murray is, but they may not. So Polly Murray, it was an early person who sort of articulated some of this.
Yes, I love Polly Murray. Any excuse to talk about Polly Murray, I will take. Polly Murray was a civil rights leader, was a second wave feminist, was actually one of the founders of Now. You don't really think of Now as having been founded by a black trans person because of their politics, but nonetheless, um, Murray came up with a lot of the early theory that later went on to form Kimberly Crenshaw's theory of intersectionality, and also did a lot of the groundwork, the Ruth Bader Ginsburg Supreme Court opinions on sex discrimination. They all credit Polly Murray as a co-writer because they're based so heavily off of Murray's work. Um, but Murray was, even though it's risky to label someone after their death, it's hard to find a more classic example of a closeted transmasculine person. They spent most of their young life trying to get on testosterone. It was all but impossible for them to get it. At one point, they did get it, and then their girlfriend stole it, and they never got to take it again. It was horrific. Um, but Murray went through the world alternately being perceived socially as a boy, especially when they were younger. They went out on the railroad, or they were like arrested at protests and marked down as a young man. They were perceived as a woman later in their career. Um, they came from a black family where many members, I think, including some of Murray's own siblings, were able to and did leave home to pass for white. South of the Mason Dixon line, they were read as black. North of the Mason Dixon line, it was more complicated. So Murray's entire experience of the world was being inflected by constantly moving through different categories, never entirely knowing what someone saw when they looked at them. And that is exactly how Murray arrived at their great insight that race and sex are what they call arbitrary distinctions. You cannot conclude anything about a person based on the fact that you look at them, you see them as black, and you decide to treat them in a certain way. If that person were presented to you in a different social context as white, you might well treat them in an entirely different way. You can't conclude anything about a person's character on the basis of what you assume their gender to be, because you could be assuming wrong. That's the subtext. It's not necessarily named in some of these legal arguments, but that one insight was able to provide the groundwork for like just endless amounts of anti-discriminatory legislation. Bostock, which, I don't know how long we'll get to hold on to Bostock, but that's the case that Chase Strangio argued, that protects trans and queer people from employment discrimination, and that's based on Murray. That's Murray's theory at the core of it. It's been protecting us for like 50 years, and it's all because Murray had to live in an extremely complicated identity where they were just constantly trying to find a way to survive through these constantly shifting and sometimes very dangerous projections or assumptions about their identity that they could never entirely be sure of until you know, the exchange played out.
Yeah. Um, I always want to lift up Paul Murray because so many people still don't know about
I
them.
know. Yeah, Murray got so buried by history, and people keep, bringing it up. I think hopefully, like, the knowledge, because I think what's really nice is that Murray was never all that out, even as a queer person, and certainly not as a trans person in their life. But even towards the end of their life, they were writing about it privately, and they left like the full box of just this endless, grueling, intensely sad chronicle of them trying and not being able to get on testosterone. Like, they knew we were going to figure it out eventually. They were kind of waiting for us to come along and be like, oh, that makes sense. So I think this is Polly's time. I think it's
Yeah.
their
Well, and there's a great mural and center in Durham dedicated to them. So
That's great.
um, so um, I wanted to kind of go back to, so if trans people are kind of always doing this mirroring and this adjusting, I think what's often misunderstood by cis people is that they are too, right?
Yeah, yeah,
um, and that's a key part of feminism and trans feminisms. Is like, yeah, guess what, y'all? Like, if we get free, we can make you more free. And I wanted to talk a little bit about your experience of transitioning. You have a partner, a male partner. I
Mhm.
have a woman partner. So I transitioned in a lesbian relationship on the surface, and you transitioned in a straight relationship on the surface, which became queer, right? And people often talk about those kinds of experiences get received very differently, right, for trans
Yeah.
men. And so I wondered if you wanted to talk about that, because you have a great section in the book about what it means to sort of unman your husband by becoming visibly a man in the world.
Yes. The idea that our relationship was only tenable because one of us was the woman. And this is something that I talked to Jay Edaton, who's a comics person. They run a really great X-Men podcast. And they also had to come out as a trans man while married to their co host on the podcast. And he was really illuminating on it because he was like, look, they already thought that I was a bitch because I had strong opinions, because I put myself on an equal conversational footing with a man, because I was covering a stereotypically male subject. It was very, very easy for the narrative of I'm emasculating my husband because I'm a mouthy woman to turn into I'm forcing my husband to be gay now because I'm a man. And I got a lot of the same things. People would often bring up the fact that I had a husband as if it was, laughable, or as if it was shameful for him that he had to now pretend to be gay. And it was just, one more item in my nonstop campaign of aggression, against this guy, really running him down into the dirt. I think that there's this unspoken assumption that you can only be a man in the sense of being in charge if there's someone else on a lower plane beneath you. You can only be the person in the relationship if you have this other person whose job is essentially to be support staff. And that sort of gender nonconformity really often, um, it gets weaponized to hurt butches, and it gets weaponized to hurt trans men. There's a lot of underneath, like, joking about how I made my husband gay. There's a ton of corrective rape that gets aimed at masculine of center people because they're perceived to be transgressing the rules of femininity. There's a ton of violence that happens specifically to render someone, a step down.
Mm-hmm.
But that violence also happens to, like, any given woman who tries to make herself an equal partner in her relationship. Not in every single relationship, but the drive of women to be seen as people within their relationships, and the idea that it's, terrifying and compromising for a man to be gay because it makes him somehow woman like, or at least it makes him not definitively the man in the relationship. Those two things are so deeply linked that it's almost not worth discussing them as separate problems. They move together always.
Yeah, and even within trans male spaces, trans masculine spaces, there can be weird hierarchies between men who have transitioned towards heterosexuality and men who have transitioned towards queerness, which is
Yeah.
wild because like it you were gay 5 minutes, I was gay, like, to move towards, I still think of myself as queer, but certainly there are many historically butch trans men who think of themselves as heterosexual and have weird stuff with gay trans men. Um,
Yes.
and that's such a like in group problem. Like I don't even necessarily like that feels very private, right? Like because I'm like we have so
Yeah.
much stuff from the outside, but and that's misogyny, right?
Yeah.
It's just misogyny, but it's like trying to talk about. There's so few spaces for trans men to get together and talk about the reasons why we might be invested in various structures within our relationships, right? And like trying to access masculinity through our relationship dynamics or how we are perceived with our partners or things like that. Like there are almost no spaces for us to do that. And so it comes out sometimes very sideways, I think.
No. And I mean, that's what Lou Sullivan fought for, right? The idea that, like, you literally cannot be a man unless you're out there getting ladies is, it's ingrained in all of us. And it's ingrained in trans guys too. I feel weird sometimes, as an adult transitioning into being visibly queer. I feel less weird now because now, like, my daughter came home and was like, I'm not allowed to play at so and so's house because I have two dads. And I'm like, well, now no one can say I'm faking it. I mean, there we go. We've got the cred. There are hideous bigots in the world. But it is weird to have an identity that's based entirely around your ability to, like, dominate someone else. And I think it's weird for cis men too. And I think that's why you see these guys that are, going insane and subscribing to YouTube channels about how to run a sex trafficking operation in Romania. Is that if your only sense of who you are comes from dominating other people, and if your only sense of safety or power comes from being in an unchallenged position of dominance, you're in for a bad time because everybody is under someone else's control. No one is in control all the time. No one ever actually fits this ideal of masculinity as being totally independent and self sufficient and needs nothing and is 100% in control and competent at all times. So I think it's one of those things where, I spent a lot of time rattling the cages of femininity, and that was just because it wasn't a good fit. But I don't think that patriarchal masculinity is actually healthy or useful for anybody who's trying to adopt it either.
No, no, not at all. And one of the things that I find so interesting, my partner jokes with me about this all the time, is that like we'll have some, household problem and we'll have a repairman come to the house and like inevitably I'll end up talking to these men for like 2 hours. And she's like, "Oh my God, why are you still in the basement with the plumber? Like, what the fuck are you doing?" And it big these dudes are so lonely. And they're so and I think because they perceive me to be a straight cis man, it's like safe to talk to me, but
Yeah.
also I still have feminist abilities to ask questions and like ask follow-up questions and tell me more and all, and so like we'll have these very long emotional, and so then like I'll come back upstairs later and be like, well, his kid just got diagnosed with ADHD and he's really worried about his wife, and but what it does point, in the larger culture there, all of this conversation about the male epidemic of loneliness.
Yeah.
Yes, men are lonely. They are making themselves lonely though. Like this is not, I mean, it is systemic too. I don't want to like, but it is systemic because of class and race and all of these other things. Like the
Yeah.
people on, on the very top are making us all systemically lonely, right?
Yeah.
But it is cis straight men who are on the whole doubling down on their own isolation and loneliness because they feel that they must go it by themselves and not rely on anyone else and not have real friends and not talk about their feelings except with the women that they are having sex with. Like, that's sad, and it is
Yeah.
lonely, you
Yeah.
know. um
And
and
like
that's
everybody's lonely, women are lonely too. But like if men were talking about male loneliness because they wanted to realize that they were like interdependent on other human beings and wanted to like open up and build stronger bonds of community, that would be great. What's not great is how many of these arguments end up with like a New York Times op-ed about how we need to just assign them girlfriends, you know, because it's a really sad, built to fail dynamic where these guys are not taught how to handle having emotions or how to bond with other human beings, but they are supposed to have like a support person in the form of a wife or a girlfriend who's capable of catching 100% of their emotions all the
yeah,
time and teaching them how to deal with it or just dealing with it for them. And, I think that that's going to make both people in that relationship lonely. You don't end up in a less lonely relationship. You end up in a relationship where no one is happy.
yeah,
So,
it's
yeah.
horrible. It's totally horrible. So I wanted to, you talk about mothers and mothering in here, and um, I did want to talk about that because I think that might be surprising to some folks about, why is mothering in a book about DILFs. So why was it important for you to have a chapter on mothering?
For me, I think it was how the figure of the concerned mom is so often used in like turf rhetoric as like I am a woman I have done the woman thing of reproducing and giving birth, and now my child wants to mutilate their healthy breasts and may become infertile. And like the idea, the sacredness of motherhood gets picked up and warped in terrible ways by the turf movement. But it's also because like the institution of parenting has been warped in some really hideous ways by capitalism, where like again, this is like women are lonely too. Women are expected to do work that no one in history has ever had to do. We don't historically rear children in two-person units. Children are traditionally reared in community, and that's because they're a ton of work and they will find any available thing that they can kill themselves with and just grab it if you're not looking. Like you need to have a whole group of people taking care of your kid. But instead of that, we have a capitalist society where motherhood is marketed to, it's marketed as a category, it's sold back to you as an identity, and with that identity comes the mindset that like you need to produce the best kid, the most competitive kid. The higher up in the economic bracket you go, the more material there is like aimed at you producing a really excellent kid. And what happens then is that if your kid has an experience that you can't relate to, like in many cases being queer or being trans, you have no one to talk to about it, and they have no one to talk to about it. They just have you. And instead of being able to be there for your kid while they figure it out, or God forbid, connect them to some community resources so that like elders can talk them through it, you double down on trying to create a kid that is, top of the line, A plus, will be the envy of all your neighbors. And that means treating your kid as a product, as an object, and stamping out anything in them that escapes your control. And it's, I'm not trying to like spread blame around here, but it's all of these systems are reinforcing each other, that we're cut off from any sense of wider community or communal responsibility for children. And that means kids are getting trapped in these abusive situations where they're primarily being seen as an achievement of their parents and not as people in their own right. And that's where, like Abigail Schreier's irreversible damage comes in. It's very much like someone read Reviving Ophelia and was like, how can I make this evil? Just deeply, deeply evil in every way. Like,
Well, Yeah, so let's talk about irreversible damage because that is like in the trans masculine world, everybody that's just a dog whistle. We all know what that is. But and for people who work with parents of trans kids of all genders, they probably know what that is. But for adults who are watching this who don't have kids or who are not trans themselves, they may not know um, that she's our Voldemort, to use another enemy's language. So, can you talk about her and what she's done?
Yeah, irreversible damage is sort of written as a parenting manual to help you deal with the crazy youth fad of transmasculine people existing. And it's aimed at parents of transmasculine children. There's not a lot about trans girls in there, just because for a brief moment it was thought that there were many more young trans men transitioning than there were trans women. Now we know that there's just about the same amounts that trans girls are coming out slightly later. But never mind. This is written in this very chatty, like just us girls, like you know how it was when you were a kid. You ate Tide Pods and you had a hula hoop, and that's what these kids are doing, except they want to be on testosterone. And it's so hard to convey the uncanny evil of the book because it's trying to be like this pro-feminist manifesto for how to raise healthy girls, but every once in a while they'll just like drop something like feminists have convinced young ladies that there's a rape culture and that they're treated unfairly in the workforce. Could this be why so many of them are transitioning? Like it's just like deeply anti-feminist. There are chapters about like sending your 12-year-old off to a prison camp with no internet. That's just like the physical labor will help her reconnect to her body. You know, it's horrifying because it's hate literature presented as like an upwardly mobile parent's guide for treating your child as if they have no agency at all and no capacity to make decisions. Essentially, this is not far removed from like Victorian texts on hysteria, except that it's specifically aimed at young trans boys and men, casting them as, you know, infantile and unable to know themselves and prone to making silly, drastic decisions that will one day prevent them from being wives and mothers, the only true joy they are ever meant to know, right? So,
Can you describe the cover for people?
okay. This is the universe I live in where I feel like everybody has that cover, like when they close their eyes, it haunts them. It's like a little baby doll with pigtails, and she's very adorable, but her entire midsection has been scooped out. There's just a hole there, signifying, I guess, like she doesn't. There are so many like scarring, terrible stories about surgeries gone wrong, and yet I find them hard to take seriously because I don't think Abigail Schreier actually knows what gender affirming surgeries entail. So it's possible that the hole is caused by testosterone. It's also possible that it's caused by a hysterectomy, which is really unlikely to be performed on a 12-year-old. But it's just, you know, it's that. It's like they're going to take your white womb that you've been safeguarding and, you know, it's always pretty much always. I talk about this in the book, but once you see it, it's so impossible to unsee it. Anytime there's like that photo of like, oh, the horrible warped bodies of transmasculine detransitioners who can never reproduce. It's like it's always, always, always white people. Like it's definitely like a threat to white reproduction. And, you know, again, it's really hard to separate how gender and race function in this particular instance.
Yes, because so often the trans feminine other is a person of color, and the trans masculine deluded figure is a white
Yeah.
child, and we
Yeah.
see that. So the black woman becomes monstrous and larger than life, and the white, you know, boy becomes, you know, tiny and infantile and incapable of
Yes.
doing any harm or making any decisions. And you know, I keep thinking about that Republican group chat that JD Vance is commenting on recently that was super racist and horrible. And it's the young Republicans, meaning people under 40. And
Mm-hmm.
he keeps saying like, well, these kids, and it's like, well, like these guys are in their 30s, right?
Yeah.
Like not
Yeah.
children. but again, it's this white innocence, and that we have to preserve white bodies and white fertility, and that is linked to white innocence, right? Like that all
Yeah.
of that is tied together. And there is some concern for like white trans feminine people's reproductive capabilities, but it is much, much lower. Like you just don't see, people are not like, but what about the testes? Like that's not a thing that people are really worried about.
Yeah.
Because they don't presume that white trans women are going to be making babies with cis women. Like they don't,
Yeah.
they think that trans women are um absolutely gay men in disguise, right? And so they don't imagine that like they're having sex with other women, and so they're not worried about that, but
Yeah.
they are
And
very
to
worried
be honest,
about.
we don't have as much of a language for talking about testes as public property. Like
Yeah,
a uterus is basically always everybody else's business,
right.
you know? Although I mean, I think it's a pretty even trade-off between being seen as like an idiot child whose only destiny is to make a baby and being seen as like the clown from It who's sucking children down into sewers and is a monster who must be destroyed. It's really, both of those are hideous, right? I don't
Yeah,
think that there's any like competition for like who's getting it the worst there.
yeah, no, it's all terrible. And so you know I would love for folks, if you have questions, now's a great time to put them in the chat. Michael said the isolation itself is a system of control, right? And when we were talking earlier, yeah, it absolutely is. Um, and parent isolation is part of this, because one of the things that we as booksellers have tried really hard to do is like talk to people about this book, right? Because it for many years was the number one book. If you put in trans, that was the number one book that would come up on Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
It was the number one book that would come up in many library searches. So earnest parents looking for support around, even supporting their trans kid, that would come up first. And so much of what we're trying to do is like talk to people about what are the realities of supporting a trans kid. What are the actual realities of medicalization, good, bad, and indifferent? Because it's not like all trans people are like, woohoo, doctors, right? Like we have our own critiques.
Yeah.
But I wanted to spend some time, as folks think about questions, if you have them, talking about detransitioners and
Yeah.
talking about the TERF movement, and what that is, and why people that J.K. Rowling, all that stuff, like people really are confused. People who are not inside this world, this feminist world that you and I are very much a part of, they don't understand. Well, these people say they're feminists, and you say you're a feminist. So which one is like the real feminists? Who wins,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
So can you kind of break that down for folks?
Yeah, there's absolutely a market for detransition stories, and most of the detransition stories that are used in, let's say, court testimonies for legislation or in newspapers, like there's a real market for like a white detransitioned woman. There are people, Eliza Ray Shoup, who died earlier this year, was a trans woman who briefly detransitioned and worked with the right on crafting testimonies, and she was really ill and suffering for a lot of the time she did that. But there wasn't enough of a market for some reason. Trans women are so comprehensively dehumanized that people want to see like the little white girl who needs to be saved, right? And that to me is something that it's essential to understand, that like detransitioners have always been part of the trans community. And like if you look at Stone Butch Blues, which is like this iconic sort of trans and or lesbian and or whatever it is novel, it's about somebody who starts testosterone, decides they don't like it, and stops. And that's always been part of queerness, that you can move into and out of different identities. You can change your pronouns 8 times a week if you need to. I did when I was first coming out. But to be able to move freely and explore your identity is the goal. The narratives that are about like, oh, I was seduced by the transes into thinking that all my problems would be solved if I transitioned, and now I'm racked with regret. For the most part, these are coming from organized groups who are working on those talking points and who are working on placing those talking points in media. And in reality, I've been on at least one trans podcast hosted by a detransitioner, like just like talking about this book. There are so many of us in and around the community because we end up with the same medical needs, we end up facing the same discrimination. And I think everybody understands when they take their first steps toward coming out that if you find out one big shocking thing about yourself, which is that you need to transition, there's really no rule that you won't find another big shocking thing about yourself that means you need to detransition. For the vast majority of people, that's not the case. But if it is, no big deal. At least you know, right? Am I answering your question, or am I just like I'm like spitballing here?
Yeah,
Like
no,
there's
you totally are. Let's talk about turfs though.
yeah,
And
right. I mean, I think that that's always been, if you look back at the transsexual empire, like there's kind of like, I always think of like irreversible damage and transsexual empire as like the Old and New Testament of like the TERF movement. But transsexual empire definitely was focused exclusively, almost exclusively on just like berating and tearing apart trans women. And they were doing that specifically because there were trans women who were welcome and occupied places of authority in the second wave feminist movement. And this was a power grab to push them out. And it was a long, ugly, hideous war. And it's detailed at some, at some length in the book itself. But transmasculine people were always seen as just lost little lambs in need of saving. The idea Raymond wrote was that women don't need to transition because we already have something that gives us the power to challenge gender roles, and that's feminism. So if you're a trans dude, you aren't feminist enough yet. You need to just get more feminism in there, ram it in all the nooks and crannies, and that'll eventually make the dysphoria go away. It does not work like that. Shockingly, but it is a convenient rhetorical dodge because it allows you to dismiss any trans woman as like a sexual predator, a fake woman who's making light of women's suffering, and it allows you to dismiss any trans man as a misogynist, who can't embrace womanhood, so why should you have to listen to them? It's a really neat rhetorical device for making sure you never have to listen to any trans women or trans people ever. But it's, shockingly not an accurate reflection of reality.
yeah. One of the things that I loved about this book is that you have a really great, sort of additional reading. Obviously, as a book person, I was very excited about that. Um, you know, there's a it's chronological. There's so many ways for you to enter into these books, and you say very clearly, like, you will not agree with all of these books.
Yeah.
It's important that you don't agree with all of these books, that actually is part of reading. And so I wonder if you could talk just a bit about what surprised you in your research and reading for this book. What books kind of surprised you the most, or what theorists surprised you the most, for better or for worse?
Well, I loved getting to spend time with Shulamith Firestone and Bell Hooks and Polly Murray. Like those were all just people that I sort of wanted to visit. I thought that they provided a really great grounding in a feminism that is, not biologically determinist and not essentialist and, you know, based on challenging the dominance ethos at the core of patriarchy. Those were people that I really liked. What I really appreciated, though, was I was able to find Beth Elliott's memoir. Beth Elliott was the woman who was pushed out of the West Coast Lesbian Conference for being trans. She wrote a sort of a pseudonymous memoir / novel under the name Jerry Netick that went really in depth on her experience, and it's called Mirrors. And I absolutely recommend you spend time with it. It's a really vital document of like what that moment in history was. Um, and I really loved that, I've been reporting for a magazine called Extra for a few years now. And so I tried writing a draft of this that was just my opinions, and I was like, oh my God, dude, I'm you, and I'm still sick of hearing about your childhood. I'm so sick of you. So I went back in, and I was able to interview a lot of people in the community and get a lot of different viewpoints in. So whenever I felt like something was getting like too oppressively caught up in what my own experience was, I was able to talk to some other people. Oh, Jane Ward. I assume everybody but me knows Jane Ward. But I loved Jane Ward wrote two really great books. One's called The Tragedy of Heterosexuality, which is about what we were discussing before, the idea that heterosexual relationships are sort of built to fail, and that men and women are taught to believe that they are utterly alien to each other. They have different interests, they have different needs, and they still have to live together because that's how shit works. She also wrote Not Gay, Sex Between Straight Men, which is it's a rich text, I tell you. It's just basically about all these ways in which just like sexual contact between dudes happens within like permitted heterosexual settings. If you go to a frat hazing, you're gonna touch somebody's junk. But and yeah, so that one maybe was just for me. Maybe that was just fun for me, but it is cited in the book. um,
There's no rule that says you can't enjoy the research. Um,
uh,
well, tell me, so you've come to the end of this book, and there must be a bit of relief for you having written it.
I mean, it's out there now. I mean, I think now the real fun begins because it's so, like anytime you publish a book, you're sort of put out there in a position where like you have to tell other people that it's awesome and that you know what you're doing and that you're totally a spokesperson for your community. And I am none of those things. What I'm excited about for this book is like who's going to disagree with it and how's that disagreement going to push this forward? Like I think that trans guys don't get a lot of room to talk generally, and they don't get a lot of room to talk about feminism in specific. And just to have a book out there that potentially is like irritating to many different audiences is, the irritation is like the sand that produces the pearl. That's how we get a lively conversation. I hope, you know.
Well, as Michael said, endorse, hashtag endorse. I also endorse it. I think, I don't think it's irritating, but that doesn't, but
No.
I'm aligned, so
Yeah.
take that with a grain of salt. I mean, I think, you're very generous to a lot of people in the way that you're presenting your ideas. And I think it's very accessible, and pulls apart a lot of assumptions without being, like cruel or judgmental about why people might make those assumptions. And I think that's what we need right now. Like, I think of thought around gender anymore. And Twitter culture has not made us better thinkers, unfortunately. And so, it is my hope that lots of people will read this, and lots of people from a wide spectrum of feminist thought will read this and engage with it, because I do think you are very, again, generous to particularly our feminist elders, and give them their due for the things that they were striving for, even when they missed the mark, but also the things that they got right, and they did get a lot of things right. Even Andrea Dorkin, right? So yeah, I totally agree with what Michael is saying in the chat. DILF is the kind of book that can make people brighter. It's a great entry point in our next step in the reading. So thank you for writing this book. We're very glad that we got to be your first stop, to celebrate it. The book officially comes out on Tuesday. So everybody who's watching this now is getting a sneak peek. Michael wants to know, when do you start your definitive profile on Shulamith Firestone? Yeah, I agree. We would love
I
that.
see. Well, I would love that too. I think a lot of the work has already been done by Susan Faludi in the New
Yeah.
Yorker. She was able to get in there and talk to all of her peers. It's really shameful that there's no biography of Firestone. Like
Yeah.
literally this one long New York profile that came out right after her death is all there is. And also Airless Spaces, which Shulamith Firestone wrote 2 books in the course of her life, which to me is shocking. But at the end of her life, after she'd been, in and out of mental hospitals, she'd been struggling, she wrote something that was like a lot of people from these movements wrote. It's partly fiction, it's partly memoir, but it gives you a sense of what the rest of her life had been, and thank God for that. But yeah, I do think that somebody who's a better biographer than me needs to get in there. Like I don't know who's doing these. Deirdre Barrett did the Simone de Beauvoir biography. Rosalind Rosen. I can't remember who did the Great Pauli Murray biography. I'll come up with that later. But but somebody needs to get in there because she was a hugely influential figure, and most of her life is completely obscured. Oh, Brienne Fast did the great Valerie Solanas biography. I would love to see Brienne Fast get in on that because it's a really similar situation. Somebody did one thing and then disappeared.
Yeah.
But
But had such an outsized
yeah,
influence on the
I mean,
culture.
it's shocking to me. Like every story I've ever read about the second wave features Shulamith Firestone in some respect, and yet she was active in the movement for 3 years. Like every single group she worked with kicked her out. So she was. This was 3 years of a person's life that reshaped how we thought about gender for like it. A century. That to me is fascinating. I want more of that. I want somebody who's better at biography than me to tell me how that happened.
It makes, when I think about somebody like Shulamith, and even in reading your bit about her in the book, it makes me wonder who those people are today that we are dismissing or afraid of, or I don't know, calling kooky and not taking seriously, because they're certainly mad geniuses right now that are saying things that are gonna be really influential, but we're not hip to them right now. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean it's nuts how prescient the dialectic of sex is. Like it's not just prescient about like reproductive technology or changes in the nuclear family. There's just like a passage where she offhandedly invents Wikipedia. Where she's like, schoolwork will be easier when you can look it up on the computer banks. Like, oh, it's true, it will be.
That's so wild.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's I'm gonna drop, in case anybody's like, what are y'all talking about, I'm gonna drop the link to the dialectic of sex in the chat, so that if you want to read that amazing book, you can. And there is a collection of critical essays um, that is expensive, but it is critical essays on Firestone that um, might be of interest to folks. So I'll drop that in the chat too. Well, I'm so grateful that you spent this time with me tonight, Jude. Thank you so much, and thank you for this book. I think it again is really important and valuable, and I look forward to handing it to lots of people. So I appreciate you.
Thank you so much for having me, and I appreciate you a ton. Thank you for the work you do.
Yeah. So if you folks watching haven't purchased DILF yet, you can buy it by clicking this teal button at the bottom center of the screen. And if there are people who would have loved this chat but were not with us, just let them know that it's going to be up on Charis's YouTube channel in just a couple days. So, all right. Well, stay safe and well, Jude. Thank you. Can't wait to hear more in your future writing.
Okay, thanks. All right,
Take care.
bye.